recording started.
So we have now reached the end of the semester, and we are tying some things together, kind of taking a look back and a look forward, thinking about where restorationism has gone, as well as what the future looks like for the restoration movement. Don't forget that the critical review essay, the second critical review essay, is due this Friday, so make sure to complete that. Secondly, the exam is a week, the final exam is a week from Thursday. The study guide is available on Blackboard, so don't forget that as well. Remember also that there will be a review session. In fact, the video for that has already been recorded, so hopefully that would be helpful to you. If you have any questions after reviewing the review session, any questions specific to the final, please feel free to get in contact with me. Let me know what I can do to help as you finish up the semester. Don't forget as well that I sent out an email about the student evaluations, and I would appreciate if you had the chance to fill those out, give me some feedback. That would be very helpful. Since this is the first time I've taught this course, I want to really kind of have an idea of what works, what doesn't, and so make sure to take the time to fill out that student evaluation. So,
We get points today.
yes. So, as we are finishing up, we're basically looking at kind of some. We're looking at some general things, not so much a historical overview today, but just kind of a general look at the idea of restorationism, and thinking about what restorationism has meant at various times, and kind of where that fits in with the current situation here in the 21st century. To do that, I want to kind of reflect back and re-emphasize some things that we had talked about at the very beginning of the semester about the different components that make up the restoration ideal, some important principles in restorationism. And of course, there were a couple of things that we talked about with just the idea of the term restoration itself, as restorationism develops, this particular form of restoration develops. With that, of course, is the idea of return, particularly return to the apostolic pattern of the church. Also, with the idea of restoration, normally that carries ideas of repair sometimes. So if you're restoring furniture, for example, you're repairing it. Well, similar types of things are meant when restoration is talked about religiously. There's something wrong that needs to be repaired. Also, the idea of restoration frequently carries with it the connotation of recover. There's something that has been lost that needs to be restored, and so you're recovering that. And with that as well is the idea of renewal. All four of these different ways in which restoration can be used are reflected, I think, in the American Restoration movement. There is the notion of return to the apostolic pattern, of repairing Christianity that has gone in some directions that was not intended to go. There were certain things that needed to be recovered, restored to the practice of Christianity, and some things that needed to be renewed, that had kind of fallen by the wayside or needed to be revived. Specifically within restorationism, the restorationism that we looked at in the context of this American Restoration movement, there are some important key concepts or principles that restorationist leaders have reflected throughout the history of this movement. One has been this opposition to a denominational type of mindset. Now, we noted that this was, certainly the case in the early part of the Restoration movement. After the division between the disciples and the churches of Christ, the churches of Christ tended to hold on to that notion of anti-denominationalism, while the disciples, many of the disciples, fostered a mindset of taking the place of, in the American religious landscape as another denomination, which is what a lot of the independent Christian churches were opposed to, which led to one of the factors that led to the split. But ultimately, the idea of the Restoration movement, for a majority of people, has been, this attempt to move away from having different denominations that make up the larger scope of Christianity globally, and trying to just be the church of the New Testament, which did not have denominations. Another key component has been anti-creedalism, this idea of holding to the Bible alone without needing a confession of faith or a creed or some other belief statement to kind of lay out what it is your group believes, but instead Restoration movement thinkers have often emphasized that they go simply by the Bible. And so, the rejection of trying to hold on to, or the rejection of human attempts to codify the teachings of the Bible in a statement-type form. And as we talked about, the mentality was, the slogan was, if a creed contains more than the Bible, it contains too much, it contains less than the Bible, it contains too little, if it contains the same thing as what's in the Bible, then it's unnecessary because we have the Bible. So this kind of rejection of creeds and confessions of faith, especially in the context of making them terms of communion. I'm going to fellowship with you. I'm going to consider you a fellow Christian because you believe this particular creed or this particular statement of faith, which are, in the minds of a lot of Restoration thinkers, human inventions. That instead, our fellowship with each other should be based on what the Bible teaches. Third, Restorationism has also tended to emphasize the importance of the common person, a rejection of an elitist approach, particularly from the standpoint of clergy, this kind of educated clerical class that often ruled over churches. And of course, we've talked about how that developed in this opposition to certain types of education, certain types of approaches to biblical study. All of those are reflective of that anti-elitist approach. We also emphasized some positive things. The Restoration movement, of course, was against some things and for others. One was the emphasis on Scripture alone, at least ostensible rejection of human tradition. But when you, of course, get down to it, groups are going to develop traditions. And often those traditions operate at levels that even the group is unaware of, and has a profound effect on sometimes how a group worships, how a group exists. For example, many churches that are not in the liturgical traditions, so there are groups like Catholics, Orthodox, Anglican, Methodist, some other traditions that are often referred to as high church or liturgical traditions. What that means is they have a very set pattern of worship that involves the saying of certain prayers at certain times, the singing of certain songs at certain times, and it is very ordered, formalized procedure that is across the board in the different churches of those denominations. But even in some of the low church expression, these congregations that don't necessarily have a formalized liturgy of you say this prayer, this specific prayer at this time, you sing this specific song at this time, often reflect a liturgy, at least a low-level liturgy, right? Of, well, we sing a prayer and then we sing a song and then we have the announcements and then we sing two songs and then there's a prayer, and two songs and then a scripture reading, another song and then communion, right? And so there is this kind of practice that develops of how you engage in worship. That is not necessarily scriptural. There's not necessarily unscriptural either. But there's no pattern in Scripture that says, two songs in a prayer, song, communion, etc. But often, if you find a situation that deviates from that, where if you sing 4 songs and then have communion and then have a prayer, you're going to find sometimes opposition to that, or at least uncomfort with that, because people are so set in those traditional ways of doing things. So even though Restorationist churches have emphasized the importance of Scripture alone in contrast to human traditions often have a power within themselves of, kind of getting set up and instantiated in religious groups that carry a power that's sometimes unrealized. But essentially, they're kind of got far field of where I wanted to go. But Scripture alone being a very important concept. Another important positive concept of what Restorationists have been for is unity, trying to find ways to bring Christians together. Now, often there has been a mixture of unity and restoration, as we've talked about, where on the one hand, the emphasis of the disciples of Christ has been unity and very, very little restoration today. And some very extreme conservative congregations among churches of Christ have been predominantly about restoring the New Testament church and very little about unity. In the middle, with the independent Christian churches and the churches of Christ, you kind of find a little bit of a mix of both. This desire for unity of Christianity, but also a desire to restore the New Testament church. And often, those more moderate groups have tended to think of it as unity will occur when the New Testament church, and when people buy into the New Testament church, the restoration of the New Testament church. Another important key concept of restorationism has been the influence of commands and approved precedents or examples. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the idea of how you determine what should be done is based on the command and the examples found in Scripture. We've also talked about the importance of the silence of the Scripture, this notion of a negative regulative principle, treating silence as prohibitive. And in the context, of course, of that, we talked about how there has been 3 major views of silence in the Scriptures, silence of the Scriptures since the Reformation. The Lutheran view has tended to be more one of things are permitted as long as they are not condemned. So if the Bible doesn't specifically condemn something, then it is permitted, it's allowed. Again, unless it kind of counteracts another command found in Scripture. The Calvinist approach has been a much more of a vague approach of things have to be consistent with and guided by Scripture. Not a very clear, a clear statement that you can kind of put into practice very easily. The Lutheran approach, of course, is pretty easy to put into practice. If it's not condemned, you are free to do it. And of course, on the other end is the Zwinglian approach, which says if Scripture doesn't approve something, then you shouldn't do it. Right? Those two items seem to be kind of clear as far as general principles. How they've been enacted, of course, is a different question. But a lot clearer than this Calvinist approach of this kind of notion of it needs to be guided by and shaped by and limited by Scripture.